So the book of Ruth is geographically set in two places. We've got Moab and we've got Bethlehem. And so in some ways it's a tale of two cities, two places. You've got Bethlehem, which means house of bread, could even be place of plenty, which symbolizes God's provision and God's providence, something we looked at last week, the providence of God, how he uses his power, his sovereignty to work all things together for good. Then we've got Moab, a symbol of all that is opposed to God and to his people. So Moab's a symbol of that. If you like, the world without God. So last week we said the Ruth is about God's providence, and that is a big theme. But the other theme is, you see in this book, a theme of being filled and fulfilled. And that being filled and being fulfilled are linked to these two places. The two places actually symbolically relate, or could relate to us today, as something spiritual. So where are you at today spiritually? So we've got the geography of Moab and Bethlehem, two places, but where are you spiritually speaking? Where are you at, we could ask. We're seeing this chapter. We're going to read it together. We have not had it read, but we're going to go through the chapter, not all of it, some of it next week. And we're going to see that Naomi, one of the main characters of this book, even though it's named after Ruth, Naomi is in many ways an equal, at least, main character. She's not in a good place, and we can see why in a minute. In the past, she has been in a good place. Her name, Naomi, means pleasant, and so we could read into that, even her name, that this is telling us something, that life at times has been pleasant. Probably raised in Bethlehem, the house of bread, the place of plenty. That's where she probably grew up, surrounded by a wider family. We discover later in the book, probably quite a wealthy family. So her life in Bethlehem had been pleasant. She'd been filled and fulfilled, at least for a while, and then things change. So we get to chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrodites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So it tells us, as we looked at last week, that the book of Ruth is set in the time of Israel, when they had no king and the nation was ruled by the judges, and great chunks of that period were categorized by people going their own way, rebelling, as it were, against God. And Ruth is here, set in the time of judges, where there was this cycle of people just going against what God had told them, and he had promised them in Leviticus 26 verses 3 and 4, if you walk in my ways and observe my commands and do them, then I will give you rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. So he promised them, if you follow me, physically, the promise was for them, that they would be blessed, that there would be prosperity. He also talks about there being peace in the land. But he said, if you don't do this and you go against then the commands and my ways, as those who have been called out to be my people in this world, there will be, well, it's a big word, isn't it? Retribution. It's only because it starts with R, but it's judgment. There were consequences. Yet, at any time, at any point, and God made this clear to them, they could repent. They could turn back to God and start following his ways again. And when they did that, there would be restoration. And this is the cycle of the time of the judges. This is the times that Naomi and her husband Elimelech are living in. And sure enough, we read there in verse 1 that a famine came. So there's a famine in the land. And the famine comes surely from God's hand. God allows it. God doesn't do evil, but he can allow evil and allow evil to come. And as a result of the people of God, the Israelites, going their own way, they end up experiencing this famine. And Naomi and her family are part of that. But rather than turn to God, turn back to God, repent and turn to him, as God had encouraged them to, rather than stay in the land that he'd given them as a promised land, the land for them to inherit and have, God had provided for them, rather than stay there in this place of plenty, which yes is going through a time of famine, but all they have to do is turn back to God and it will be restored, they decide instead to go to Moab. Now Moab isn't that far away, is it? A neighbouring land, now Jordan. But Moab and Israel had history. Moab was a place that God specifically said, don't go there. Don't be part of what they do and be part of them. They had opposed Israel, so they had opposed God. They had times tried to deceive them. They had religious practices which were pagan. So God's prohibition on them going there wasn't racial, it was religious. They had these gods that they would sacrifice children to. They had prostitution as part of their worship, and God said, do not go there. In many ways this would be like playing with fire to go to Moab. We were reading yesterday, the men, a few of us, Romans 12 verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of the world. That's the idea. Don't go to Moab. Don't conform to the pattern of this world. Be separate. And so they must have known, actually, from all that God had already revealed to them, that to go to Moab was not a good idea. It was wrong. God had warned them against the bad influence that these other nations would have on them, but particularly Moab. Moab even was picked out as one particularly not to be part of and go along with. A godless nation, a nation that even opposed God and were against him. So in doing this, surely they were following their own wisdom rather than trusting in God's wisdom, doing things in their own understanding. And I'm sure we all kind of empathize and think, well, they were just trying to save themselves and their family. But there is a sense here that they're not trusting in God, but leaning on their own understanding and not acknowledging him in all their ways, as Proverbs 3 verses 5 and 6 encourages us to do. So yeah, things weren't easy, and you can sort of understand that why they would do it, but life is sometimes like that, isn't it? We go through barren patches, and spiritually speaking, we might be going through a barren patch or experience barren patches, but rather than move us towards God, what happens here is they move away from God. So rather than the barren patch and the famine being the reason that God gave them that experience was actually to bring them back so they would repent, they instead leave. They actually leave this home that he had given them. So symbolically, and you don't have to agree if you think I'm reading too much into it, but them leaving home is almost symbolically turning from God, the place of his provision and plenty. Yes, going through a barren time, yes, going through famine, but God had already made it clear, but if you return, if you come back to me, I will restore. So you see that going to Moab, if you sort of see that as a picture of the world without God and the worldly way of doing things, you can see how surely this is a slippery slope, no? And it's interesting how verse 1 says that they went to Moab for a while. For a while. They went to live there for a while. Their intention was just for a little while. And that might be where we sort of justify things. I just need to do this for a little while. I just need to take that job, or stop going to this meeting, or stop being involved in this, and put my finances in this place and that place for a while. I just need to take control of the situation myself for a while. But as suggested there, it's a slippery slope. Before we know it, we might be like them, just so incorporated, so caught up with, just part of really the world. And so inevitably this is what happens. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This move has not worked out well. Firstly, her husband dies, and secondly, her sons end up marrying Moabite women, something, as we already said, was prohibited by God, not for racial reasons, but for religious reasons, because of the danger of being sucked into that way of living, that idolatry, which had all those evil practices. So, although what may have looked good and seemed to taste good initially, leaving Israel to go to Moab to find food, in the long run, at the end of the passage, verse 20, Naomi actually says it's left her feeling bitter and empty. Bitter is like, a bad taste in her mouth. What seemed like this would be so good, look so good to eat, to taste, but actually it's left a bad taste in her mouth, bitter. And they went to get filled, and they come back. She's now empty. They left the house, or they left the home, the place where God had provided them with, the place which symbolically Bethlehem means the place of his provision, a place of plenty, the house of bread, and now she is empty. So again, that question, where are you, but where is she? She's now in a dark place, understandably. She's lost her husband, she's lost her 2 sons. And you may have ended up in a dark place. And some of it might be because of decisions and choices. Some of it may just be the way it is, and this is what has happened to you and you're going through. But it may also be that it's because of choices, decisions made. Either way, Naomi has experienced incredible tragedy, and you may have too. She's lost everything. She's feeling alone. She's feeling isolated. She's a long way from her real home, where she wanted to be in life. She's a long way from there as well. So you can understand if she is also beginning to lose hope. She's fled famine, but now has actually experienced funerals that she probably sought to avoid. So living in Moab actually has led to devastating consequences. So again, when we preach, we just have to go with what God sort of shows us, but you may not agree that it's in the text, but my sense is here that this is saying when we are out of God's will, life might seem fine for a while. It might seem like we've done the right thing, we've made a good move because we're doing all right out of it, but over time you'll see that there's a high price to be paid, and there's an incredible price that's been paid for going to Moab. It doesn't actually say whether the deaths of her husband and sons are God's judgment. The text doesn't tell us that. But I think most ordinary Jews reading this at the time would probably think, well, yeah, God has said don't go there, you shouldn't go there, especially there, of all places, and marry Moabite women, of all women. So John Piper, he's a preacher and a writer, he suggests that if that's true, it makes the book all the more significant and incredible that because of how things end up in the end. God still works even when we sin. If we're his people, if we belong to him, God is working all things together for good somehow. And he even uses this wrong decision to somehow turn things around for good. And we see that's coming. Today's the tough stuff. The good stuff's coming. We see how he has worked, and he does work. But for now, we're in a pretty difficult, pretty bad situation, aren't we? Putting it mildly. If you're Naomi, you may even think, I'm cursed. It would feel like this is as bad as it gets. But her story isn't over. All those years away from God may have left her bitter and broken. But like the prodigal son, I don't know if you know that story, we heard about it a few weeks ago when Jeff preached. God can use that tough times, the tragedy, the dark times that we experience to actually bring us back to him, to return to him, and to be where he would want us to be. He's also like the prodigal father, who it tells us that he was looking, waiting for the son to return, always looking, always waiting, wanting him to return, not to scold him and chastise him, but to welcome him back to the place where he should be, home. And that's God's intention in the difficult things we face, the dark times, that we would turn to him, or that we would turn back to him if we have, as it were, drifted away. So he doesn't always wait for that to happen. He is like the Father, waiting and longing for us to return, but at times he does things to reach out to us, and that's what we see in these next verses. Verse 6, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So Naomi somehow hears that the famine is over back in Bethlehem of Judea, that this land, that things are good again. So even far away in this distant land of Moab, somehow God gets the message to her. That even amongst these people, she hears somehow of God's goodness, that he is providing for his people, and she sees, of course, a ray of hope for her. Bethlehem had returned to its days of plenty, and hearing this, she's, as it were, like the prodigal son, came to her senses, and she decided to return home. So it says there, she left the place where she'd be living and set out on the road that would take her home. So in many ways, this is symbolic of turning from God, but turning back to God. She's gone away from God, left home, but now she wants to go home. She's coming home. Symbolic of turning back to God. So, like I say, it's very similar to the prodigal son. It's like a prodigal son moment. The prodigal son, he had taken his inheritance, he'd squandered it, he'd left his father's home to gone to a foreign land and ended up in the same situation, bitter and empty. Reached such a low point, but he realized that the best place he could be, that he needed to be, was back home with his father. And in a similar way, tragedy in Naomi's life has brought her to this rock bottom place, this dark place, but from it she sees her need to return to God. And it's not going to be easy, even if she feels ashamed and is worried what people will say and think when she goes back empty and bitter and broken. But she resolves that she's going to return home. And you may be in a similar place today. You've ended up in the wrong place. You've made wrong choices. But all that is needed is to simply trust again in God and return to him. And it might be that we don't understand what God's doing, or we can't see a way ahead. But I love this from, it said that Spurgeon said this: when you can't trace God's hand, just trust his heart. When you can't see where God is leading or why this has happened, just trust his heart, that he is working all things together for good for those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So trust in God. And that's a sense is here. She doesn't know what's going to happen. She doesn't know what the outcome's going to be. She doesn't know. She knows it's going to be difficult to a certain extent, but she's now willing to trust in God's heart and put her life back in his hands. She knows that when she returns, she may be throwing herself on the mercy of others. She may find a negative response because of what she did in the past and what's happened to her and how people will view that. She knows it's going to be worse for her daughters-in-law, so it does tell us here how she tries to persuade them not to come with her. They were going to go with her, but she tries to persuade them not to, because she knows how tough it's going to be for her. For them, as Moabite women, it's going to be even worse or harder. But we see in these verses, and we're not going to look at them today, we'll hopefully have time to look at them next week, how there's an interaction between her and her daughters-in-law. And we get this revelation in verse 16, that Ruth has come to trust in Naomi's God. And we'll explore more how that might have happened next week. But Naomi is not alone. Ruth is committed to going with her, and so that's what happens in verses 18 to 19. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. So the two head to Bethlehem together, and arriving there, you wonder if Naomi wanted to kind of just slip in unnoticed, but unfortunately the whole town seems to hear very quickly and gather around her. And it says this: when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she said to them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi, pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." I don't know about you, but the words that really stick out for me there are bitter and empty. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. It's incredible, isn't it, how she feels, but you can understand it. She's still not in a good place. She's now back in Bethlehem, but she's still not quite there yet, is she? Bitter, empty. As we already said, that word bitter is maybe linked with taste. Things have left a bad taste in her mouth. She's empty. Again, that can be associated with being filled and with food, and Bethlehem being that place of plenty, of the house of bread. She's home, but still not quite in the place she'd want to be. But she believes it is God's doing, as this verse indicates. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. In verse 10, she said, "The Lord's hand has turned against me." So there's a sense of some sort of abandonment, maybe. Is God mad with me? Even does God hate me? I researched this a bit this week and discovered that in America, often when you write in stuff about God, one of the biggest searches in some states is those exact words: "Why does God hate me?" Some other states, the first question people are asking is, "Why is there suffering in the world?" But lots of people are asking the question, "Why does God hate me?" People must be facing dark times, mustn't they? And we can speculate on all kinds of reasons why they feel that. But there is still faith there to be asking about God. It's not, does God exist, but why does God hate me? And Naomi's not actually saying that, but she is saying, God has brought this upon me. I wonder how you feel. Where are you? We asked that at the beginning, didn't we? Bitter and empty. Maybe they do resonate with where you are at right now. Maybe you are in a dark place, a far place from God place. And that might be because you've just ended up there because of circumstances, but it might be also because of some of the decisions that we've made. You know, what is our story? What's your story? We've read some of Naomi's story, and thankfully, I've already told you, just like your story, it's not finished, nor is Naomi's story finished. We're going to see in the next few weeks how God is working in the background. And while we might be in a dark place now, we can find that God can work in our situation. And in Naomi's situation, he's moving her closer and closer to where he'd want her to be. And even when she says the name of God, who has afflicted her, who has brought this upon her, she uses a particular word, Shaddai. Shaddai is a name of God, and it's a name that people slightly struggle to translate. So in our Bibles, it's Almighty, the Almighty. So it's very much linked, the words that form this word are very much linked to sufficiency, to power, to strength. But many people say, in relation to us, this word is saying, God is saying to us, I'm enough. I can supply your need. I am the supplier, I'm the provider. And Naomi, though she's in a dark place and doesn't know what's going to happen, she's still trusting that God is Shaddai, that God is enough. Actually, some people say, really, if you wanted to translate this properly, fully, taking into consideration all that it means and who God is, it means God is more than enough. So we see here, faith is rekindling. Naomi, yes, still feels that God has brought this upon her, but there's a sense that she's trusting him for the future. And what's very interesting is she may not see it right now, but verse 22 there is this light at the end of the tunnel of chapter 1, leading us into the brighter days of the next chapters. So we get rid of the dark clouds from now on. That's just for chapter 1. We're now into the blue skies. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So they just happened to arrive at the start of the barley harvest. And Naomi has Ruth with her, who's trusting in her God and encouraging Naomi to trust in God. She's right beside her. Maybe she doesn't realize that God's provision is right there in Ruth. Ruth is going to be the one to actually be the one who facilitates and enables a big change to happen in Naomi's life. She's just going to happen to bump into Boaz, who just happens to be a relative of Naomi's late husband. One who's in a position, actually almost an obligation under Jewish law, to help them, to be their rescuer, to help restore their fortunes and give them a hope and a future. So through the next few chapters, we'll see how that happens, the blessings that are experienced, how God does restore them, and how God's provision is even in Ruth, who's standing right beside her right now. And she may not at this point realize it. But she does realize and understand and is trusting that God is Shaddai, that in him we can find more than enough. And if we're thinking about being filled and food and tastes in our mouth and linking that with spiritual things, the psalmist says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Blessed is the one who trusts in him. Blessed is the one who comes to him. Blessed is the one who finds their home in him. And this chapter is in many ways is about us coming home to God through returning. Now, we haven't had time to go into it. Hopefully next week we will. But we can do that in two ways. Firstly, we can be like Ruth, and we can come home, we can turn to God for the very first time and put our trust in God. Turn from the things of this world. Or it can be that we return back to God from going away from him. And that doesn't have to be something that we've done deliberately. That doesn't have to be something that we've done consciously. That doesn't have to even be something that we're even doing actively. But we just know that we've drifted. Well, Naomi shows us that at any point we can turn back to him. We can turn to him like Ruth, or we can return to him. And in doing either, we can find fulfillment, that he will fill us, that we can experience healing and happiness, be restored, and that will lead to rejoicing.
Christina was brought up in a very rural area where not much happened, but it was fine. It was a pleasant place to live. Yes, at times tough, and maybe she found it a bit boring. Her parents didn't want her to go to the city, but she longed to be part of things there and wanted to go to the city and had this dream of the city would be amazing. And she saved up bit by bit some money to go there. And one day, without telling her parents, she got a bus and headed to the city. She ran away from home. Her mum headed straight to the city, desperate to find her, but once she got there, realising there were millions of people in the city, there's no chance she'd find her daughter. She got a load of pictures of herself done and wrote on the back and then left them in various hotel lobbies in the hope that her daughter would one day find this picture and come home. Well, the daughter, she soon found that the money that she had ran out, and she soon found that people would abuse her and use her, and things were not good. One day she was in a hotel, and in the lobby she saw what looked like a picture of her mum. And so she grabbed it, obviously not expecting it, but she saw that it was a picture of her mum, and she turned to the back to read the message that her mum had left. It said, "Whatever has happened, whatever you have done, whatever you have become, come home." In response to that message, she decided that she would come home. She got together the little money that she had and made sure she could get a bus back as soon as possible. Life returned to being how sweet and pleasant it was before, but now with more even gratitude and rejoicing to be home and to be safe and to be with those who love her and those she loves. God invites us to come home. whether that's for the first time, having never come to him yet as our loving Father, or to return to him as our loving Father. He wants us with him. He wants us to be in his family, and he calls us and invites us to come home. Where are you? Come home.
God, I look to you. I won't be overwhelmed. Give me vision to see things like you do. God, I look to you. You're where my help comes from. Give me wisdom. You know just what to do.